in McLean versus Arkansas Board of Education, in which the defense argued that evolution was in effect a religion, and that by teaching it, school created an establishment problem that could be redressed only by giving balanced treatment to creation science, the court responded that if creation science was in fact science and not religion, it was difficult to see how teaching it could neutralize the religious nature of evolution. Assuming that evolution was a religion or religious tenet, as the minority would suggest, the remedy would be to stop teaching it, not to establish another religion in opposition to it, which is precisely the remedy that the minority is suggesting the board should apply. However, the McLean court went on to say that it is established in the case law, and perhaps also in common sense, that evolution is not a religion, and that teaching it does not violate the Establishment Clause. So the argument of the minority is not only legally incorrect, it is illogical. For they suggest to you that mainstream science teaches through the process of methodological naturalism a theistic view, i.e., atheism, and that the way to cure it is to bring their religious belief into the classroom. That is simply wrong. It is not supported by law. And at the appropriate time, I will provide both counsel for the minority as well as the board our formal brief with the citations. But it should be made very clear, evolution, the teaching of evolution as it is taught in science curriculums all across this country has never been determined by the court to be theistic. Science, the teaching of evolution, is not an atheistic process. It is merely a process of explanation of the natural world around us. The jump that the minority makes is to try to make that theistic, to argue that therefore, in order to balance, their theistic view must be taught. Clearly, the court has stated the remedy, if in fact a theistic view is being taught, is not to bring additional religion, but to stop completely the teaching of theistic views in the science curriculum. That is a very important distinction. Next, please. The abuse of the political process. The board has not followed established procedures for developing standards. They have given the minority special privileges, such as allowing them to work outside the committee process. They have allowed John Calvert unprecedented and unjustified access to and influence over the board activities. The board subcommittee collaborated with Mr. Calvert outside of the public process in proposing and organizing these hearings. The abuse of the political process. Number 2. The board subcommittee members clearly stated that their goals were to rebut evolution, put evolution on trial, and to carry through on their campaign promises to put creationist ideas into the standards. For instance, Ms. Connie Morris was quoted as saying, "I absolutely am getting more than enough information to arm me to respond to the question, are you getting evidence that refutes Darwin's evolution? Ms. Kathy Martin, quoted in the Seattle Times, said, evolution is a great theory, but is flawed. There are alternatives. Children need to hear them. We can't ignore that our nation is based on Christianity, not science. Board subcommittee members were clearly unqualified and unprepared to judge the so-called expert testimony provided at the hearings. Some board subcommittee members, as well as many witnesses, had not even read Draft 2. Some subcommittee members, in asking questions of the witnesses, clearly demonstrated a number of times that they did not understand the science being mentioned by the witnesses. Some board committees, strike that please, Madam Court Reporter. Some board committees, strike that again. I think I need a little water. Some board subcommittee members acted at times like cheerleaders for the witnesses, giving them thumbs up or solitary high fives. The abuse of political process. The board spent many thousands of dollars on these hearings. $5,000 on expenses for witnesses. When I first became involved in this process, the budget was $20,000 per side. I objected. I objected because my client, Draft 2, is the legitimate position for this board to adopt. And at this time, I'd like to thank my law partners, Bob I and Elizabeth Herbert, who have allowed me to represent Draft 2 at no charge to the state of Kansas. Our office has refused to accept a single penny of compensation because in our opinion, each penny taken by you, Mr. Calvert, for your witnesses is a penny taken from Kansas children's education. An educational fund that does not have right now the necessary funds with which to adequately educate our children. And although the court reporter does a great job for us, we have been told that there's an estimate of over $1,000 a day for that transcript. In addition, innumerable hours of Kansas State Department of Education staff time, as well as Kansas State Department of Education resources. The cost for publishing the transcripts of the hearings, security expenses, and I am really aghast at some of the witnesses that were called before the subcommittee. The gentleman from Turkey, Mustafa Akiol, A-K-I-O-L, who claimed that he was a sidearm, chair-arm scientist without any scientific training, to come in to tell us that the way to resolve American relations with the Muslim world is to abandon materialism. What knowledge, what experience, what expertise does he have to come in and tell people like Dr. Steve Case and the tremendously dedicated members of the Scientific Writing Committee that what they're doing is wrong? And by what moral authority does the Kansas State Board of Education authorize the payment for that individual to travel from Washington, D.C. to Topeka, Kansas, for us to have to listen to that nonsense? How does that advance the children of Kansas education in science? What is the benefit of that type of testimony? I'll tell you what it is. It is simply a blind effort to support intelligent design when they could not find legitimate science for their position, or good teachers to come in and tell us what is in the best interest of Kansas children. Next slide, please. Educational issues. The role of standards is to outline core fundamental concepts in a subject. Number 2, standards do not prohibit anything from being taught. School districts and individual teachers use the standards as framework in which to add more content and pedagogical material. Number 3, Draft 2 clearly encourages critical thinking and the evaluation of alternative hypotheses. And I want everyone to be clear on this. Draft 2 encourages critical thinking and the evaluation of alternative hypotheses. It is at the heart of a good education. It encourages discussion in the classroom. It is for the benefit of our children. Draft 2, Standard 1, Benchmark 1, Indicator 4, Grades 8 through 12 on inquiry states as follows. The student actively engages in conducting an inquiry, formulating and revising his or her scientific explanations and models, physical, conceptual, or mathematical, using logic and evidence, and recognizing that potential alternative explanations and models should be considered. And the introduction of Draft 2 states, the standards call for students to engage in inquiry in science, in the context of science content. In inquiry science, students describe objects and events, ask questions, construct hypotheses, test these hypotheses against current scientific knowledge and standards of evidence, and have the opportunity to devise experiments or other tests of their explanations. Finally, students will communicate their findings to others. They identify their assumptions, use critical and logical thinking, and consider alternative explanations. In this way, students actively develop their understanding of science by combining scientific knowledge with reasoning and thinking skills. Educational issues. The minority and the minority witnesses consistently misrepresented the role of the standards. I want to emphasize that. They consistently misrepresented the role of the standards and the position of Draft 2 on the student's ability to address and consider critiques of science, including evolution. The minority repeatedly claimed, explicitly or implicitly, that unless their anti-evolutionary critiques of evolution were put in the standards, students would be prohibited from even asking questions about evolution. This is completely false. This is completely false. It's completely false. The minority seem to have little familiarity, I should say little familiarity, with the reality of public school education, the attitudes of real science teachers, or the work teachers do to develop a curriculum that teaches both the content and the process of science. Minority witnesses claimed that unless the minority's proposals were adopted, we would be teaching students nothing but rote memorization and treating students like robots. They're talking about our Kansas children. In fact, critical thinking is the number one goal of most teachers, irrespective of subject area. The insistence that without the minority proposals, students would be merely taught to uncritically accept dogma like robots is insulting, Mr. Calvert, to Kansas science teachers and our Kansas children. That's an insult this board cannot allow to occur. Science and the development of scientific knowledge. The world's scientific community has a well-established process for developing scientific knowledge. This process includes developing testable hypotheses, developing methodologies for gathering data, publishing the results and analysis of the data, responding to feedback from others, and so on. In this way, solid consensus arises about what is well known. As draft 2 says, and part of which the minority wants to omit, a theory is a broad explanation that integrates a wide range of observations and tested hypotheses, inferences, and laws, when applicable, into a meaningful and coherent whole. The core theories of science have a high degree of reliability within the limits to which they have been tested and their scope of applicability. Well-established and widely accepted explanations have explanatory and predictive power and are fruitful as guides for further research. The theory of evolution is such a theory, well-established, well-tested, and accepted worldwide. And I, at this time, like to read something to you from National Geographic, and perhaps the member of the subcommittee would read National Geographic from time to time, because I found this to be a very powerful statement. And the question posed was Darwin wrong? And when you open the page that deals with the article, it says no. And I'd like to read to you the first paragraph. Evolution by natural selection, the central concept of the life work of Charles Darwin, is a theory. It's a theory about the origin of adaptation, complexity, and diversity amongst Earth's living creatures. If you're skeptical by nature, unfamiliar with the terminology of science, and unaware of the overwhelming evidence, you might be tempted to say, it's just a theory. In the same sense, relativity, as described by Albert Einstein, is just a theory. The notion that Earth orbits around the Sun, rather than vice versa, offered by Copernicus in 1543, is just a theory. Continental drift is just a theory. The existence of structure and dynamic of atoms is just a theory. atomic theory. Even electricity is a theoretical construct involving electrons, which are tiny units of charged mass that no one has ever seen. Each of these theories is an explanation that has been confirmed to such a degree by observation and experiment that knowledgeable experts accept it as fact. That's what scientists mean when they talk about a theory, not a dreamy and unreliable speculation, but an explanatory statement that fits the evidence. They embrace such an explanation confidently, but provisionally, taking it as their best available view of reality, at least until some severely conflicting data or some better explanation might come along. Next, please. Science and the development of scientific knowledge. The intelligent design movement does not, let me emphasize, does not participate in the scientific process. They do not have testable hypotheses, no research, and only a few marginal published papers. There is no theory of intelligent design. Quote, intelligent design theory, close quote, is primarily a set of anti-evolutionary and creationist arguments. Keith Miller, in a set of essays written for these hearings, says this, and I quote. Please go to the exhibit. Yes. The minority claim, I don't have it. Found it. Yeah, here we go. There is no scientific theory of intelligent design. Intelligent design proponents offer nothing to the scientific community upon which a scientific program can be developed. They don't even have clearly defined definitions of critical terms that can be understood and applied by others. For example, they have provided no objective basis upon which others can apply concepts such as irreducible complexity or specific complexity. They focus on critiques of evolutionary theory that either attack strawman views of evolution, misrepresent current science, or are simply based on flawed reasoning. They also point to areas of frontier science in which the scientific community is yet to reach a consensus. None of this constitutes any challenge to the predictive and explanatory power of evolutionary theory. In short, with regard to intelligent design, there is no there. There simply is no theory of intelligent design or anything approaching it. Intelligent design is not used in scientific research, even by its proponents. All intelligent design is a series of failed and rejected criticisms of evolutionary theory. That the minority claim that they're not trying to insert intelligent design into the standards. But as Dr. Miller points out, the anti-evolutionary arguments presented in the minority report are all that intelligent design has to offer. If evolution is false, intelligent design must be true. That is the intelligent design movement's basic strategy. Are we stopping here? Okay. We're fine. We're fine. We'll continue to go. The National Intelligent Design Movement. The Discovery Institute in Seattle and the Kansas City-based Intelligent Design Network Incorporated, with managing directors John Calvert and Bill Harris, are leaders in the National Intelligent Design Movement. Kansas is just the latest in a long line of states in which the National Intelligent Design Movement has tried to legislate their ideas into science at the legislative, state board, or local board of education level. Kansas is being used, and I emphasize once again, used by the National Design Movement. Only 2 Kansans, not counting Mr. Calvert and Mr. Harris, testified as witnesses for the minority. Consequences. Number 1, the quote, warfare between science and faith does lasting damage to both. Science teachers are inhibited from teaching evolutionary theory fully because of the types of mischaracterizations about both science and faith that permeate our culture and which are reflected in the Minority Report. Our society needs to be discussing these issues, but we should not be making the children of Kansas, and by that manner, children anywhere, or the public education system, the arena for what should be an adult conversation going on in public forums. Number 2, Kansas' national and international reputation is damaged once again, becoming notorious for these efforts to weaken the teaching of modern science and to insert invalid anti-evolutionary and creationist ideas into our science standards. This is a wonderful state. We have amazing universities in this state. The University of Kansas, Kansas State, Emporia, Washburn, the list goes on and on. I urge you, members of the media that are visiting us, to take a look at these wonderful institutions of higher learning, populated by kids who have studied in Kansas under our terrific public education system. And do not allow the efforts of a tiny minority from believing any different. This is a great state. We have terrific education. And the stain which is being placed on it is not fair and should not be taken seriously. You should help us celebrate our wonderful public education and our terrific colleges and universities across this state. Don't be unfair to those kids that have worked hard to get into those universities and who will make significant contributions in the future to our health, to science discovery, to the understanding of the world around us. This harm to our reputation is clear, and it will harm our ability to attract bioscience industries to our state. Through the Bioscience Initiative Act, the state of Kansas intends to spend $500 million to attract such businesses, a goal made more difficult by the actions of the board. And to those individuals who may be considering Kansas as a place to come and establish bioscience technology, we welcome you. Kansas children are well educated in science. Our universities are great places for science education. And we produce children whose education is solidly based on science and the scientific process. Please join us in making Kansas a better place. Legal issues. I have broadly covered these, but I think it's important to come back to them. There are a number of associated legal issues that should concern the board and the citizens of Kansas. Issues involving the Establishment Clause and the separation of church and state, as explained earlier. Issues involving the abuse of discretionary power. The Kansas Constitution sets requirements for academic and financial responsibility for the state board. The case can certainly be made that the board has failed to meet some of these responsibilities by rejecting mainstream science and by supporting the minority and the intelligent design movement. Number 3, issues involving the requirement that the board provide an adequate and suitable education for all children in Kansas. The case can also be made that the board will fail this requirement if they adopt the minority proposals. The board will be providing an inadequate education if they fail to support the teaching of mainstream science, confuse issues of faith and science, and teach failed anti-evolutionary critiques of science as if they were valid. Mr. Chairman, if possible, I would like to be able to conclude my remarks. It may take more than just 10 minutes, but if you would allow me, that way we don't have to break. Thank you very much. Some final remarks. First of all, I'd like to read into the record a letter that was prepared by Chairman Abrams about the hearings. This is a letter that was published in the Wichita Eagle. And I think it's important that this letter be placed on the record for a variety of reasons. It is a sad commentary on the state of public affairs that persons as learned reporters and editorial board members of the Eagle still have no clue as to what is happening with the Kansas science curriculum standards. The Eagle editorial, French, evolution hearings, push religious agenda, May 8 opinion, claimed that these hearings have everything to do with sneaking religious views into science classrooms. That is absolutely incorrect. At no time have I stated or implied that I wanted to insert creation science or intelligent design into the science curriculum standards. On the contrary, I have stated that I would vote against inserting either one into the science curriculum standards. Further, I have repeatedly stated that my objective is to get as much empirical science, defined as observable, measurable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable, into the science curriculum standards as possible. In addition, I have stated that I want to remove the dogmatic fashion with which neo-Darwinian evolution is taught. When a subject is discussed using words such as always and fact and no controversy, when in actuality it's not always nor factual and great controversy is involved, then by definition is being taught as dogma. The dogmatic approach is what is being advocated by the majority draft of the Kansas Science Standards. The point of the science hearings is to show that indeed among scientists with many degrees, having received many research grants, having published many peer-reviewed papers and books, and having accomplishments great and small, there is a great controversy about biological evolution being taught as dogma. They presented testimony that there is controversy about the factual nature of biological evolution. They also presented testimony that there's controversy about the definition of science as used in the majority standard. These hearings were not about my religious views. They were about what is good science. There was a huge amount of science testimony over these 3 last days last week. But to read the editorial and the article, Anti-Evolution Hearings in May 8th, Local and State, a person would be hard-pressed to know that science was the main topic of discussion. One had to read the editorial and article closely to find that 23 people testified. But one might get the opinion that indeed there weren't many scientists that testified. In point of fact, of the 20-plus witnesses, only 2 were not actively involved in science research or teaching science. Of course, the article quoted both of those who were not active in science research or science teaching. We invited evolutionary scientists from all across Kansas and the United States to testify, but they all decided to boycott. Now a thinking person would ask, is it because the hearings are rigged? Is it because of arrogance of the majority scientist? Or is it because what the majority proposes is actually full of holes? The editorial stated the case against the conservatives of the state board should be for educational malpractice. I find it amazing that you would say this in the face of the testimony of science teachers who testified that they were reprimanded, fired, and generally put on a short leash when they discussed, not brainwashed, but discussed scientific tests that seemed to contradict the fact of neo-Darwinian evolution. Further, the article referred to Jack Krebs, Vice President of Kansas Citizens for Science, as a mainstream scientist. In fact, Mr. Krebs does not have a PhD in science, but is instead a high school math teacher. This is not meant to demean math teachers, but generally, most high school math teachers do not consider themselves mainstream scientists. I have made no secret of my faith or the principles upon which I stand, nor what I would like to see in the Kansas Science Standards. Yet the Eagle persists in stating that I intend to do something that is categorically opposite of what I state. I would urge Eagle writers to become well educated about the issues. Investigate the claim of those witnesses with lots of pedigrees who claim they are scientific problems and mainstream science does not stand up to investigation. Investigate the claims of Kansas Citizens for Science, which has sought to target uneducated moderates with propaganda and proclaim the conservative state board members as political opportunists, unprincipled bullies, etc. Investigate my claims when I state I do not want to insert creationism or intelligent design, but instead want to rely on empirical science. I have tried to speak forthrightly with every reporter that comes along, but it seems that most of them, or at least their editors, are either wannabe mind readers or have an agenda of their own. As Thomas Cooper said, only fraud and falsehood dread examination. Truth invites it. Well, I think it's important that we reply to that. And the best reply comes from a man that I admire immensely, Dr. Steve Case. You're a tremendous asset to our state, sir. You're a tremendous asset to our children. You are a tremendous asset to education worldwide. And here is Dr. Case's response. I feel that I have to respond to Dr. Abrams' letter in the Wichita Eagle. Dr. Abrams ends his letter with a quote from Thomas Cooper. Only fraud and falsehood dread examination. Truth invites it. I would suggest that he be careful what he wishes for. Throughout the standard process, the expert panel appointed by the state board has worked very hard to follow the process by which curriculum standards are developed. It is by this kind of adherence to a well-structured process and by following the rules that documents of this nature establish credibility. This process, a 2/3 majority of the committee, has produced an excellent document. At all times, we have maintained a high degree of respect for all of the people involved in standards process, and at all times made absolutely certain that all voices were heard. Honestly, during this process, it has been difficult to remain respectful when being denigrated as a scientist and portrayed as a poor teacher. I have been looked in the eye and lied to on several occasions during this process. A good example comes from the second paragraph of Dr. Abrams' letter, in which he says, quote, "At no time have I stated or implied that I wanted to insert creation science or intelligent design into the science curriculum standards. Dr. Abrams must think we have forgotten trial draft 4A of the science standards that he introduced in 1999. At the time, he told us that he was the author of this trial draft of the standards. It was only through a bit of detective work that we found this was not true. The draft had been written by a young earth creationist group from Cleveland, Missouri. These were the creationist standards that were adopted by the board in 1999. Dr. Abrams was, at the very least, a driving force in the insertion of creation science into our state standards at that time. It is difficult to remain respectful when I read Dr. Abrams' statement in which he says, in addition, I have stated that I want to remove the dogmatic fashion with which neo-Darwinian evolution is taught. Dr. Abrams knows that there is a great deal of difference between science content standards and curriculum instruction. Standards create a broad vision of what is meant to be scientifically literate. They serve only as a foundation for local school districts to create their curriculum and instruction. It seems as if Dr. Abrams is promoting state control for what has been a local function, the curriculum and instruction occurring in local classrooms. However, I cannot let the assertion that the outstanding science teachers of Kansas are teaching in a dogmatic fashion stand unchallenged. It is offensive to the teachers of Kansas and absolutely untrue. I have been in hundreds of classrooms across the state, very active in statewide teacher organizations, and very active in science teacher professional development. If such behavior is occurring in the classroom, then the teacher would be found guilty of unprofessional conduct. I have never observed such behavior in any classroom in Kansas. I have found the teachers of Kansas to be very sensitive and caring about their students' welfare. The statement of tolerance found in the science standards articulately express this caring and the high standard of practice in this state. Dr. Abrams' letter is filled with such misleading statements. He continues to insist that dramatically changing the procedures by which science standards are developed is a noble thing, and that these hearings and witnesses have credibility. This is also untrue. The witnesses do not have any standing in the field and no credibility. The statements have arrogant opinions about subjects in which they have no knowledge. The subcommittee hearings in Topeka are dishonorable and without integrity. Reputable scientists and science educators should be applauded for not participating in such an event. In closing, I want to thank the Kansas Department of Education for having contacted me and allowed me the opportunity to defend Draft 2. It is a magnificent example of Kansas at its best. The writing committee did an excellent job for our children. And these hearings do nothing to change that. For our children, for our future, I urge you to discard entirely the non-scientific biased testimony that has been presented in this classroom, to keep out of our classroom the narrow theistic view that implies that evolution is being erroneously taught as faith, because that is false. Your duty is to carefully look after the dollars that Kansas taxpayers work so hard in order to pay the state. You have a responsibility that is much greater than each of you individually. You have a responsibility to the children and the future of the state. A responsibility that you have sadly failed. This was a gigantic waste of money and an insult to Kansas teachers with great potential harm to teachers and students. I stand here as counsel for Draft 2. I am not a witness, and therefore I will not stand for questioning. If you want answers, I urge you to do what you have not yet done. Read Draft 2. Thank you very much. I am done.
Pedro is the bully.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's pretty obvious.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Ergonagrai. I find it disheartening that you will not stand for questions. That was the agreement at the beginning, and I'm sorry that you're unwilling to do that.
No, sir. The agreement was if I was a witness, just like Mr. Calvert chose to be a witness. I am not a witness. I am here as counsel for Draft 2. My personal opinions, as far as science is concerned, as far as religion, are irrelevant to this hearing. The relevant evidence that you should consider is the work of Dr. Steve Case and the other members of the Scientific Writing Committee. My views about science, my views about religion are just that. They're my personal views. And I believe that they should not be regarded for the record. Thank you very much.
Dr. Abrams?
Yes.
Given the breach of the rules by the opposing counsel, the rules being that we would have an opportunity to cross-examine for an amount of time equal to half of their presentation time, which would be approximately an hour. I don't have any problem if he doesn't want to answer my questions, but I do think, given the fact that I should have an hour, I should have the opportunity to respond to what he has just said. And particularly in light of the various aspirations he's casted on a number of people in this room.
That is not the process. He had 3 days. 3 days.
Pedro, you're not the guy to be talking about
Mr.
process
Calvert.
here.
Mr. Calvert.
Don't interrupt me, Mr. Calvert. You had 3 days. Those 3 days are over. I had 3 days. I have chosen to take less than 2 hours. And as counsel, I'm not standing for questions. That doesn't open the door for more from them. You do as you wish. The judge will be the people of the state and this media. And I urge you not to further make the mistakes that have been made before.
Thank you for your comments.
I did not plan to speak this morning. In fact, Ed Sisson is a lawyer from Washington, D.C., Arnold and Porter, and he became interested in this issue a while back, and we've been working together. And so Ed was going to do the cross-examination. He also was prepared to cross-examine the many scientific witnesses that we expected to be called to rebut the case that we put on during the first 3 days. But of course, there were none. What you saw today was oratory from one who is not a scientist, one who is not a philosopher, one who is not an educator, one who is a lawyer. And we all know all the different lawyer jokes. What you heard today was simply oratory from a lawyer. What is so significantly absent from the majority case is the data. Where is the data to support the claim of evidence so overwhelming that there can be no dissent. So the case for the majority simply is completely and totally empty. There is no evidence. There is no data. Only oratory. And that's consistent with the very first exhibit that we presented, which is a strategy memo that was authored by an officer of one of Mr. Iganagari's clients, Kansas Citizens for Science. And that memoranda explained not only the strategy that's being used now and that was used during the last 2 hours, but the strategy that was used in 1999. And what is really disturbing to me is that this is a strategy that the science community seems to be embracing. Thomas Huxley once said, "Science commits suicide when it adopts a creed." Science commits suicide when it adopts a creed. There is a creed involved in this debate. Evolution cannot be criticized. And you heard Mr. Iganagari say that, because of course if we allow evolution to be criticized, then guess what happens? People can then look at the evidence of design, which we have otherwise suppressed. So, in order to maintain the suppression of the evidence of design, we also have to effectively insulate Darwinian evolution from any scientific criticism. So what does that happen to evolution? Where is the test? Where is the scientific test for evolution if it can't be criticized? Look in your dictionary for the definition of the word boycott. Boycott is a mechanism designed to coerce silence. It's a mechanism to intimidate. And so what is happening here is that you're seeing those in positions of authority seeking to discourage and intimidate scientists from stepping forward and stating what is in their minds, what is in their heart. It is ugly. It is really ugly. This is what the strategy is. Quote, "The strategy at this point is the same as it was in 1999. Notify the national and local media about what's going on," all of you in the audience, "and portray them in the harshest light possible as political opportunists." And you saw that. Where is the data that backs up that? Where are the witnesses that back up that? Even the statements out of the mouth of the individual that voiced that slander would not allow himself to be questioned on that. Portray them in the harshest possible light as political opportunists, evangelical activists, ignoramuses. Dr. Russell Carlson, one of our witnesses, provided us with a CV. These are the CVs. That book is about that thick for 23 witnesses. 23 witnesses. I was going through, we were getting ready for this, I was going through the CV for my friend William Harris. He is really an incredible guy. Dr. Harris is the most humble guy I think I've ever known, and his brilliance is just mind-numbing. And he works so incredibly fast. I just don't see how he can keep so many balls in the air at the same time.